in the presentation today, I will cover several topics. The first one is really to think together about Romani people and to understand where they come from and who they are. Secondly, I would like to go to the concept of racism and discrimination and see what are the differences between them, and also to go a step down and look at manifestations of anti-Romani racism in Europe. In the second part of the presentation, I want us to think together about the measures that have been taken to dismantle anti-Romani racism and really to have a conversations about the reasons why there is so little action taken in that direction. And finally, we have to talk about the role of the state and societies in creating anti-racist societies, but also to suggest some possible steps forward in the Eastern Partnership region, but also beyond. Let me start by saying that when we speak about Roma or the Romani people, we are actually referring to a global diaspora of more than 15 million people. In 1971, at the first World Roma Congress, Romani leaders agreed on Roma as the umbrella term to identify various Romani groups: Roma, Boiași or Rudari, Gitanos, Cale, Sinti or Manouche, Gypsies in the UK, Lom, and Dom. Since 2010, the Council of Europe, and I'm talking about the Council of Europe because it's the framework for our conversation, also switched from using the word gypsy in the early 90s to identify Roma and using later on Roma and Travellers. They switched to using Roma as an umbrella term too. And to the Council of Europe, the term Roma means various Romani groups such as Roma, Sinti, Cale, and other related groups in Europe, including Travellers, and in the Eastern group, and also the Eastern groups, Doms and Lom, some of them in your countries. And it covers basically the wide diversity of the groups concerned, including people who identify themselves as gypsies. And indeed, Romani people in the UK, for instance, do identify themselves as gypsies. However, to many other Romani people in other countries, gypsy remains a controversial and also an offensive racial slur, which carries a lot of historical weight, but which is also rooted and constructed in the false idea of Romani roots coming from Egypt, and that idea was developed in the early 1500s in England. But as many other peoples, Roma have hybrid and fluid and diverse identities, influenced by various geographies, self-transformation, interaction with non-Roma people, and other factors. As I want to clarify from the beginning that in this lecture, the issues that I discussed do not apply equally and homogeneously to all Romani people across Europe. But indeed, a decentralized, global disparate population of approximately 50 million Roma live across the world. They are separated by borders, by national languages, by Romani dialects, local history, and also traditions. Many of them have little consciousness about their global Romaness, or more simply put, their global Romani identity. But Romani people do share a group history, a culture, and I also say that they also share many forms of local or national Romani identities. Roma fled northern India approximately 1,000 years ago, and many moved Western Asia into southern and Eastern Europe. Today, the majority of Roma indeed live in Central and Eastern Europe, but there are Romani people in the Americas, the Middle East, and Australia too. In the countries where our participants come from, we can see that there is a smaller Romani population. For instance, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, the Council of Europe estimated about 2,000 Romani people, which is less than 1% of the population in each of these countries. But in Belarus, we talk about a population of about 50,000 Romani people, in Moldova more than 100,000, and in Ukraine 260,000 Romani people. Basically, in Moldova, we can say, according to the estimations, that the Romani population forms about 3% of the Moldovan population. Looking back, looking back at the history of Romani people in Europe, but also beyond, we have to say that Romani people were not well treated by Europeans throughout their history. They were enslaved in two principalities in what is today Romania from 1385 and perhaps earlier to 1385 to 1855 or 1856. Romani people who were enslaved were different from the peasants who were also working on the properties of boyars in Romania. They were enslaved by the Orthodox Church. They were enslaved by the state. That they were also enslaved by the boyars. The Romani people were sold. Their children were sold. And although the laws would not allow for their so-called masters, basically enslavers, to kill them, that happens oftentimes. Romani people are also subject to expulsions during the Spanish Inquisitions and for centuries thereafter across a range of other European territories. In Spain, Romani people are also victims of the Great Gypsy Roundup, a genocide that happened in 1749 and that killed a quarter of the Spanish Romani population back then. Romani people were victims of the Holocaust. More than 500,000 Roma people were killed during the genocide. And we also talk about Romani women and their intersectional oppression, as for instance in the case of Romani women who were sterilized by force in various countries during or after the Holocaust. And these countries, if we are to give some examples, we can look at Austria, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, and then the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Finland, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and also Switzerland. And today, Romani people continue to be targets of victims and targets of violence and also mistreatment. But I will talk about that a little bit later. So now let me stop for a second and try to look at the concepts of racism and discrimination. And as you could notice, I did not use the words racism and discrimination until now, because I do want to clarify their meaning together first. As we can see on the screen, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI, define racism as a belief that a ground such as race, color, language, religion, nationality, or national or ethnic origins justifies contempt for a person or a group of persons. Racism, they say, is the notion of superiority of a person or a group of persons. I think that the word justifies in this definition is fundamental. But I think that racism is more than a belief. I believe that racism is an action that we see on an everyday basis. And therefore, I want to suggest that when we talk about racism, we define it somehow differently. So my definition of racism is that racism is oppression, is a system of oppression imposed through power, exploitation, control, contempt, and neglect, and indeed justified through the ideology of superiority of a dominant, empowered group. That means that racism is structural in nature, And it does not mean only individual racism that happens between individuals. It does not mean only belief. Racism transpires in all aspects of our lives, in all aspects of our societies, from history to laws and policies, to cultures and societies. Also, as you know, and I'm not going to talk about this too much because many of you come from institutions that deal with human rights in your countries, but I just want to provide this definition so that we can look at them in a definition of racism and discrimination in a mirror. As you know, Council of Europe talks about discrimination in events when discrimination occur, when people are treated less favorably than other people that are in a comparable situation. And only because they belong or they are perceived to belong to a certain group or category of people. People may be discriminated against because of their age, disability, ethnicity, origin, political belief, race, religion, sex or gender, sexual orientation, language, culture, and many other grounds. Discrimination can be direct or indirect according to the European laws. And when we talk about indirect discrimination, what the Council of Europe and other institutions say or how they define it is an apparently neutral provision, criterion, or practice that de facto puts representatives of a particular group or a disadvantaged group compared with others. They put them forward for a bit, and to clarify that discrimination does not equal racism, but rather we can say that discrimination in the case of racialized people is one of the many manifestations of racism. Racism does not involve only prejudice or discriminatory actions, but more so, it involves social, cultural, and institutional power. There are various manifestations of racism, and the manifestations are pushed through various means. One of the most relevant means is institutions. As we know, laws, policies, actions are designed more often by dominant groups. And most often they reproduce historical and existing injustices as well as prejudice. In the case of the Roma, it is very easy to reproduce injustice and racist ideas through policies and laws, among other reasons because policymakers, for instance, as well as experts and scholars who conduct work on social and economic disadvantages and inequalities of Romani people, they often hold racist or biased beliefs. In the academia, we will see many scholars who are writing about Romani people, and the interpretation of data is often very biased. They tend not to trust Romani people and what they say when they are interviewed. There are many problems with the way that we conduct research with Romani people, and that reflects also in policy making, given that many policymakers would use data and academic work to inform their policies. But the second reason is also because there is a lack of representation of Roma, and consequently a lack of a Roma voice, and also lack of Roma expertise in culture, science, media, scholarship, intergovernmental organizations, local and national governments, and in all aspects of politics, policies, and life. And as a result, very often laws, policies, and measures neglect and misinterpret Romani realities and Romani needs. And we can't ignore the broader problem, and that's the social, cultural, political, and economic power of dominant majorities. But when it comes to institutions, we also have to talk about institutionalized racism that takes very overt forms sometimes, including through police violence or segregation in education. Culture is another mean that it's powerful in the way that racism is spread and maintained. It's very, in a way, it's very simple because the norms, the beliefs, the values of dominant populations are considered to be the standard, the right thing to do. And in this context, often racialized people, including Romani people, are seen and portrayed as vulnerable, inferior, criminal, or simply ignored in cultural products. And perhaps the most simple example of ignoring a minority in cultural production is really the lack of children's books with Romani characters in the case of the Roma. And perhaps you can take a second and really think about how many books, children's books you read as a child or your children read, and Romani characters are involved in those narratives. But I also talk about the continuous denial of the history of state-sponsored injustices, and there's some sort of disinterest from states to ensure the moral right of Roma to reparations. I'm talking about acknowledgement, apologies, compensations, memorializations, and truth-telling in cases of collective state-sponsored injustices. And finally, I think that societies and individuals also play a role in maintaining racism. Individual racism happens not only through intentional racist discourse or actions, but also comes through to reproduction, intentionally or not, of ideas rooted in the ideology of inferiority and criminality in the case of Romani people. And we see that in the way, for instance, some teachers treat Romani children in schools. Teachers come in the classroom with the assumption that Romani children do not value education because their culture and their parents do not value education. As a result, oftentimes they treat Romani children poorly and they don't pay too much attention to their academic performance based on that racist idea. And of course, you see the results in the number of Roma who actually manage to finish, for instance, high school or university. But individual racism also manifests through covert and overt forms, or what some people also call implicit or explicit biases. And one of the most overt forms of individual racism is really instances of hate crimes and instances of racist discourse. We hear many politicians, including members of the European Parliament, having racist discourses against Roma. These statements are very direct, very clear, and very racist. But there are also covert forms of individual racism. And we are talking about stigmatization or everyday discrimination or what other people call everyday racism. These are less obvious manifestations, and they are translated into the lack of respect or poor services in public places, or those times when Romani people are treated with indifference or are over-scrutinized, misunderstood, feared, underestimated, overlooked, or shunned. Instances when Roma are ignored, stamped and treated as lazy, inferior, criminals, when basically their humanity is questioned and denied. And again, I want to go further and talk about anti-Romani discrimination and manifestations that are more clear and in many ways they are more collective, but also manifestations that are of racism that are put in place by representatives of state institutions. And I'll start with an incident that happened in April 2020 this year in a city in Ukraine, where the mayor decided to transfer by force a group of Romani people from their former shelter to the border with another region, under the pretext that the mayor wanted to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic from his city. A video posted online shows the mayor getting irritating and actually using racial slurs when he learned that while a group of Roma were already transferred to the other side, to the other region, there are other Roma, 12 of them, who refused to go on the bus and move. While the Minister of Interior announced starting criminal proceedings against the mayor, NGOs had long pointed at the rise of anti-Romani violence, including from far-right groups that are terrorizing Romani communities. No need to speak much about it. Clearly, this action is discriminatory. And we have to salute the Minister and the Ministry of Interior for having taken immediate actions. But what I want to underline is that racist solutions similar to the one put in place in Ukraine happens in other parts of Europe too, in many parts of Europe, in fact. Such measures rooted in the idea of Roma inferiority, or measures rooted in the idea of Roma seen as carriers of disease, can be found in cities in Romania, for instance. In Miercurea Ciuc, in the summer 2004, the local authorities evicted around 100 Romani people and moved them in containers. For almost 16 years now, they have been living in a toxic area. In Bulgaria, during the pandemic, special measures were taken against, not for, several Romani communities, to the point in which they basically created police checkpoints at the entrance of Romani neighborhoods. In other instances, local authorities built walls to separate Romani neighborhoods from those in the majority population. What you see on the screen is a wall built in Baia Mare, Romania. On the left side of the screen, the wall includes a graffiti that says "Stop Racism, Stop Segregation," and this was an action taken by activists after the wall was built. But on the right side of the screen, you can see basically some graffitis, some drawings from art students from Cluj who were sent to Baia Mare to create these drawings and graffitis. So basically, what we are seeing is a group of students helping a racist mayor to maintain a racist wall that separates the two communities, and making the wall nicer just by adding some children's pictures and graffitis. Such walls are also built in other communities in Romania, including in Turlungeni and Brașov, Sfântu Gheorghe, Covasna, or Mehedinți. And there are similar walls in Slovakia. For instance, there are 14 walls there, including in Kosice and Ostravani. And there are also walls in the Czech Republic, such as the one in Ústí nad Labem. Along with the fact that these walls are obvious violations of human rights and obvious acts of racism, they create many other negatives. The Romani people behind the wall continue to be discriminated against, but also isolated, neglected, ignored, and more importantly, they are dehumanized and they feel dehumanized. While in many countries there is anti-discrimination legislation to address such overt cases of discrimination, very often prosecutors, judges, and courts do not see the discriminatory nature of such acts. And I think there is a long conversation about why that happens and how we can overcome bias, implicit or explicit, at the level of these relevant institutions in order to provide justice for Romani people as much as for any other people. For instance, in between 2006 and 2015 in Romania, Romani CRISS, a Roma-led organization based in Bucharest, documented 48 cases of police brutality. That meant 7 Romani people killed and 187 Romani people beaten or tortured. In all the cases that Romani CRISS brought to court, and together with the Romani victims, the courts rejected the complaints. But all the cases that Romani CRISS brought before the European Court of Human Rights were given justice in a sense that the court recognized the violations of rights that the state did not recognize. And this is not just about Roma. In Denmark, last week, a prosecutor stated that the torturing and killing of Philippe, a young black Danish man, could not be racially motivated because the attackers and the victim knew each other. And there are several elements that are important in this case, including the fact that one of the attackers had a swastika tattooed on his body, and the other one as member of a White Lives Matter movement. There are other circumstances, though, when such violations of rights follow a certain pattern, and they are pervasive and collective in nature. And we can take, for instance, the case of school segregation of Roma children, especially segregation in special schools. Some of you may know the DH and others versus the Czech Republic case, which is a landmark case of desegregation in Europe. But in several other cases from Hungary and Greece and Slovakia, a few dozen Romani children did receive remedies from the European Court of Human Rights judgments after the European Court found that the Romani children had been unjustly placed in special schools. However, as my colleague at Harvard, Jacqueline Bhabha, and I argue in a chapter on reparations, do you think that 4,000 euros, the amount that each of the applicants in the DH case received as remedies, undo the lifelong impact of social, economic, and emotional mistreatment of Romani children in an educational system that has an inferior curriculum? A majority of these Romani children cannot go to court. And although the European Court of Human Rights accepted as evidence and therefore as true statistics showing the structural nature of segregation and demanded policy changes, how do we ensure, though, reparatory justice for collective injustice? How do we ensure justice about education and the systemic nature of racism in education? And I'm going to apologize for using data, but I think it might help the participants in our webinar to understand a little bit more the nature of structural inequalities in their own countries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, where we have a little bit of data. So in countries like Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, many Romani people are excluded from the educational system, but the lack of official desegregated data lessen the accuracy of need assessments and policy making. In Moldova, as we can see on the screen, only 21% of Romani children were enrolled in in primary education or preparatory classes. The study is from UNICEF Moldova, and it was conducted a few years ago, but I dare to say that the numbers have not changed much. Also, only half of the Romani people are enrolled in primary and lower secondary school, and only 16% are enrolled in upper secondary school, while less than three-quarters attended school daily. Only 4% of Romani people in Moldova are enrolled in higher education, and this is such an important indicator that really should raise many questions at the level of policymakers, and really think about better policies that can support Roma to go to the level of higher education. And among these measures, really desegregation of schools and prohibiting segregation and discrimination in schools are some of the key responses. Also, a recent UNICEF Georgia report shows that a significant number of Moldovan Romani boys and girls are homeless, living on the streets in Georgia. In fact, as we showed earlier, Georgia has a small number of Roma, but is still failing to protect its Romani communities, which have a very low level of education. In Ukraine, the access of Roma to primary education also continues to be unjust. In 2015, reports showed that 24% of the Roma in Ukraine had no education at all, while only 16% had gained the primary education. In the Donetsk region, for instance, if 1,000 Romani children enroll in primary education, only half of them make it to the 5th grade and 1/10 to higher school. And here I want to stop for a second and really try to deconstruct a little bit the idea of Roma as a culture or as a people that do not value education. First of all, I do want to underline that whenever we think about justifying inequality through the lens of behavior or culture, that is a racist mindset. There is no such a thing as a culture or as a people that has a common behavioral problem. There is such a thing as inequality and structural inequality. And the fact that you have, and I'm not going to use percentage, but I really wanted to use numbers. So if you have 1,000 Romani children who are sent to school by their parents, who are supported to be in school by their parents, but only half of them make it to the 5th grade, and only 1/10 to high school, I would say, and perhaps get your support in thinking, why is it that reality so so unfortunate and so unjust for Romani children? And I think that there is a lot of work to be done with teachers and with schools, not only in terms of not discriminating against Romani children, but also by employing anti-racist measures and classes. And I will also add one more piece of data, and that is that over 90% of Romani children in Ukraine are pushed out from schools, only completing 5 or 6 years of education. And finally, only 1% of Romani people in Ukraine make it to university. A similar trend as in Moldova, and a similar trend as in many other countries in Europe, including in Romania and all over the European Union. But I think that in Ukraine, what is important to underline is that the 2019 Educational Act negatively impacts the enrollment of Romani children to early childhood education and also to primary school. The new law gives enrollment priority to children who have identification documents. And some Romani children living in informal settlements are really put at risk by this measure. Some of the local activists in Ukraine, and I hope that we talk a little bit about this later, also argue that this policy and its stipulations might lead to an increase in school segregation as well. But once again, these discrepancies and inequalities are not pushed by the Romani culture or their poverty, and we know that there is a racist ideology in the minds of many who create policies, and that's that Romani culture is an inferior culture that does not value education. And that leads us to believe that Romani people do not want to be educated. But I think that what I would argue, and I've written quite a bit about it, is that the reason why we see so many structural inequalities in education and the reason why systemic racism is so obvious in education is because of structural injustices that resulted from a history of injustice, from present-day racism and discrimination, and from a neglect or bias in policy making. So it's not just teachers who believe that Romani people do not value education. There are many policymakers that have the same thought too. For instance, if you were to look at the European Union's framework for Roma inclusion that just ended, what we can see is that the aim of the European Union was to encourage Romani children and adolescents to go to high school, whereas the youth strategy of the European Union created clear indicators for European adolescents to make it to high school. Therefore, they created better measures. But there is this idea, very much rooted in a racist ideology, that what we need to do is to civilize Roma, to learn Romani children how to teach and to write, but not necessarily to imagine a better future for them, which includes, in many cases, access to higher education. And when I'm talking about neglect in policy making, for instance, if we ought to take the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, where the Romani population is really very small, how do we ensure justice in education? How do we ensure that the 2,000 Romani people in each of these countries do benefit from justice and quality education, knowing that the number of children is much smaller than that? Romani people indeed lack social, political, and economic power to make demands in these countries, but also in many other countries. The non-Roma politicians and policymakers have no incentives beside the moral argument or some demands from intergovernmental institutions to ensure justice for Roma. Yet, what would it take to give up a racist mentality and a racist society which sees Roma, for instance, as beggars? In some reports in the Eastern Partnership region, what we see is that authors write that Romani people have as occupation, as main occupation, begging. There is no such a thing as a culture or a people who have begging as an occupation. They are pushed into that into that activity. So what would it take for us to implement anti-racist policies, basically together with Roma, not without them? Romani racism, we should first and foremost focus not on non-racist policies, but rather on anti-racist policies, measures, and actions that involve the agents of racism, institutions, laws, policies, societies, culture, and even ideology. And deploying a framework focusing on anti-Romani racism would ensure a focus not only on individual Roma who experience discrimination, but also on the collective experience of Roma with racism. A focus on anti-Romani racism in education, housing, employment, or health should not address only racism as perpetrated by non-Roma individuals, but should also examine the role played by institutions, laws, policies, societies, and cultures in reproducing and maintaining inequality and racism. And finally, I think it's really important to employ positive measures in, for instance, in education or employment, including special seats for Romani adolescents in universities or high schools. We do need to have Romani experts involved in policy making, not only as tokenistic voices, but really to use their expertise and their voices in creating policies, in creating laws, not only Roma related policies, but also mainstream policies. And we need more representation of Roma, or representation of Roma, because there is not much on it in public spheres, through educational materials, to symbols that reflect Roma culture, including in museums, local municipalities, in hospitals and schools, but also through other means such as literature, television, and research. And we need to desegregate schools, especially schools, special schools. And for that, we also want to make sure that those who do not follow the law and segregate Romani children in special schools or in separated classes or buildings, they are sanctioned. And more so, I think that along with the measures that you added in the word cloud, I think that we do need to ensure reparations, apologies and acknowledgement, and also compensations for children who are victims of school segregation, but also for other types of collective injustice. And we need to add anti-racism in curricula at all levels of education. But for that, we also need to revise and to replace textbooks and other school materials that reflect Roma in a negative and stereotypical way. And we have to come up with more progressive materials to show the history and the realities of Romani people. We need independent bodies. One of you mentioned earlier racial profiling, and I think that having an independent body that is able to look at cases of discrimination conducted by public officials is essential. We need independent bodies to look at police violence and racial profiling. And finally, I think that more generally, and this is, I think, more abstract perhaps in terms of next steps, is really to have a focus on economic, environmental, and reparatory justice for Roma, as opposed to trying to look at what the European Union calls Roma integration. We need anti-racist measures in order to ensure Roma inclusion. We need to prepare the societies. We need to prepare our policies so that they are ready to welcome Roma as equal citizens. We can't treat racism unless we target the agents of racism, meaning laws, policies, societies, and cultures. Now, I'll stop here, and I want to thank you so much for your participation in the webinar, and I look forward to listening to you.